Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I am Bearded Dev and this video is all about stored procedures. Today we're going to be looking at what is a stored procedure, how we can create a stored procedure, how we can then execute that stored procedure, and the benefits of stored procedures. So what is a stored procedure? A stored procedure is reusable code that is stored as an object within the database that we can run again and again. Let's jump over to SQL Server Management Studio and we'll go through some examples. Okay guys, so we're on SQL Server Management Studio now. I'm just going to open up a new query window and let's open up the tables as well and have a look at those. So a common query we get at the bookshop is we want to know how many of a certain amount of books, how many of a title of a book we've got in stock. So if we just run a query, select all from books, we can see here we've got 9 books in total, and in this table we just store an ID, a title, the author, year, and so on. So we get a lot of queries from customers saying how many of this book have you got in stock. So normally what we'd write is we just want to get the title and the stock amount from our books table, and we want to say where our title is a brief history of time. So if we put that in and execute that query, we can see there we've got two of those books in stock. Now the problem is we don't want to have to keep writing this query. We want something that can run this query for us. We just want to input our book and we want to know how many books we've got in stock. We don't want to keep writing out of this query. And that's where stored procedures come in and can be beneficial. In a software scenario, what we'd normally have is a front-end system. So a customer would come up to the desk, we'd type into the front-end system the book, and then ideally what we'd get come up on screen how many of that book we've got in stock. So let's move on now to how we can address that situation in the database. I'm just going to show a few little tricks here. Well, not so much tricks, but shortcuts. If you open up a new query window and want to create a stored procedure, but you're not 100% sure of the syntax, what you can actually do is right click here and click on Insert Snippet. And this opens up a mini window here to ask you what sort of snippet you like. So in this case we'd like to create a stored procedure. So we just double click on that and we're going to select Create Basic Template. And we can see that's loaded up for us the basic syntax for creating a stored procedure. Another alternative to that is we can open up in our database Object Explorer on the left hand side, we can open up programmability. We can see we've got here stored procedures. If we right click there and click on new stored procedure, this opens up a template from there which is in a lot more detail. So I just wanted to show you 2 ways you can just generate the syntax for a stored procedure if you're not entirely sure. In this example we are going to be writing a stored procedure from scratch. I'm just going to highlight this area here and copy that because that is important to have as part of the stored procedure. So we want to store who created this stored procedure, the description of what the stored procedure does, and when this was created. Imagine we're working in a team of developers, that information can be vital to them. Underneath description as well, we'd usually have changes and a date stamp in there so we can see when another developer has made changes to that. It just helps us all in the long run to understand what another user's done. So in this case I'm going to change the author to myself, Bearded Dev. The creation date we'll say is today, the 24th of the 1st 2017, and the description is retrieve book title and stock available. So I'm just going to put that in there so if another developer was to open this stored procedure in the future, they would know exactly what the purpose of this stored procedure is to do. And then from there we can start with our query. So I'm just going to take the query we had from our first window, which was select the title and the stock amount from our books table. And we want to create a stored procedure, so when our user types in on the front end the book title, we want to know how many of that book is in stock. So we're going to go ahead and create our stored procedure. So we're going to write create procedure. You can just write the word create proc. I'm just going to write out procedure. Proc and procedure are interchangeable, they mean exactly the same thing. And let's give this a name. So we're going to call this P, so we know it's a stored procedure when we're looking at objects in the database. That's just something I like to put there just to identify that this is a stored procedure. And we're just going to call this pStockCheck. So our first instruction is create procedure, and then we want our name, in this case is pStockCheck, and then we're going to say as, and there we have pretty much the basicest not really a word, is it, the most basic stored procedure you can create. So we're going to create procedure as StockCheck, and it's going to select title stock from books where the title is a brief history of time. We can also put this within a begin and end block, which I would recommend, so I'm just going to wrap that in a begin and end block there as well. But we have got a problem with this query. We don't always want to check that the title is a brief history of time, so we're going to take out that where clause, and now we're left with the title and the stock amount from books. But if we run that query, we can just highlight that query in the middle and run that, we're going to get all the results back. We could have hundreds or thousands of different books in stock, and we don't want to have a full list and have to scroll through that. That's not efficient, it's not fast, it's not going to allow us to find that at speed and give good customer service. So we need to address that situation. And one of the benefits of stored procedures that I will recap on later is that we have the ability to pass parameters into this stored procedure. So what is a parameter? A parameter is something that can change. So we'd set a parameter as a certain data type, and that can be passed in with certain information. In this case, we're going to be looking at setting the parameter as our book title. So that's going to be a character string, but it could come in with a different title each time. So what we need to do that is underneath the create procedure statement, before we indicate the as to what the actual query of the stored procedure is, we're going to list our parameter here. You can have multiple parameters within a stored procedure. We're going to call this parameter, we're just going to call it at title, and I'll just set that to VARCHAR, and we'll say 50 for now. I don't think we've got a title. In fact, I'll set that to 100, just to be on the safe side, just to make sure we haven't got any books that would exceed that amount. So now we're going to be passing in our title to this stored procedure. So we want to build that parameter into our where clause. So let's look under our statement. We want to select title from books, and we're going to say where our column p title equals our parameter at title. So we're going to pass that into it. I'll just space out this query so it looks a bit clearer. So we've got up here create procedure and our procedure name. We've got our list of parameters here. In this case, we've only got one. We can also assign a default value here. So I could say as a default Lord of the Flies, and what that would mean is if we don't actually define what the parameter is when we execute this stored procedure, it would always default to Lord of the Flies. In this case, we don't really want a default because there's nothing that's going to be a generic search or a specific search that we need to return if nothing's entered. In this case, we would always expect a title to be entered. So I'm going to take that away. That was just to show you that you can have a default value if nothing was passed in. I am going to be doing a mini-series on stored procedures as well, so we're going to look at things like ISNULLs and set no count on and what they do within the stored procedure, but this is just a very quick example of how we can quickly get up and running with stored procedures. So if I press F5 now to execute that query, we can see command completed successfully, and when we get that result, that means we have successfully created that stored procedure. If I was to press execute again now, we would get an error to say there's already an object named pStockCheck in the database. If I wanted to create two very similar stored procedures, I'd have to change the name slightly. Once you create an object with a name, the Management Studio itself will check if that name already exists. So you can't have two objects with the same name. You would have to have it different. So now we're going to move on to how we can actually execute this stored procedure. So I'm going to open up a new query window. So how we execute a stored procedure is we can either write the word exec or execute, and then we give the stored procedure name, which is pStockCheck, and we also want to pass in the parameter of title. So we're going to say the title equals, it's a character string, so we need to open the parentheses or apostrophes or whatever they're called. So we're saying execute our stored procedure pStockCheck and set the title to Lord of the Flies. Let's execute that query now and see what happens. Okay, so we can see we've got the correct results returned. We've got the Lord of the Flies and we've got the stock. So if I ran a query just to indicate what the same results, just to double check that we are returning exactly what we were expecting, where column title equals Lord of the Flies. So if I just highlight that and execute it, we get exactly the same results. So that is proof that our stored procedure works. So normally what we'd have is our front end system, the system that our colleague in the bookshop is working on. As soon as a customer comes up to her and gives her a title, in this case Lord of the Flies, I want to know how many copies of Lord of the Flies you've got in stock. Our colleague would normally key that into a front end system. The front end system would pass that as the parameter and execute that stored procedure against the database. The results then would be passed back to her on screen, and you'd see Lord of the Flies, we've got one in stock. Let's go through another example where we're going to look at multiple parameters within the stored procedure. So I'm just going to copy this to a new window, and we're going to say retrieve customer address. So let's first just have a look at our customers table. So I'm just going to select all columns originally. So now we're going to narrow that down. You see first line, second line, city, postcode, and we'll return telephone number as well. And we can see in the second line of the address we have nulls in that field, so I'm just going to handle those by using a ISNULL. And if we run that query now, we don't really want 0, we'd rather have blank in that column. Let's give it an alias as its original name. Okay, so we've got our query now. So what we want to know is when somebody gives us their first name and their surname, we want to be able to retrieve this information. So again, we're going to create procedure. We're going to call it pCustomerAddress. We're going to list our parameters here. So first name as VARCHAR 50. And then comma, last name as VARCHAR 50, and that's going to be as begin. Our select our select columns from our customers table, and we want to say where first name equals our parameter first name, and last name equals our parameter last name. And we'll just close that off. So if we run execute now, we've now created another stored procedure. So let's have a look at executing that in a new query window. So let's just get some customer first names and surnames just to make sure this works correctly. So I'll just run a query from our customers table. So we've got our first customer, Michael Smith, so we can store procedure, customer address, our parameter at first name equals Michael, and our parameter at last name equals Smith. And if we execute that now, we can see we've now returned the customer address. So let's go back to our creation. So we've got a comma separated list of just 2 parameters here. Usually we're running massive queries with multiple parameters, but you can get stored procedures that are as simple as this. If you're just starting out working with stored procedures, I recommend just throw a couple of simple ones together first, and then think of some really complicated scenarios. You can also run some DML statements, so insert, updates and deletes within the stored procedures as well, and we'll be moving on to that in other videos. This is just showing how to create your basic stored procedures, so just beginning with stored procedures and how they work. It's worth mentioning as well, when you're actually executing the stored procedure, you don't have to actually name the parameters. So I could take out this first name here, and I could take out this last name and just pass in Michael Smith, and if we highlight that and execute that query, we're going to get exactly the same results. But imagine when you start working with multiple parameters that could have default values and some you aren't passing in. If you're doing it in this scenario, you actually have to pass them in the order, otherwise you will see some either strange results or an error on the query. So I always think it's best to indicate to SQL, actually name the parameters and set those to what you're actually passing in. So just to recap, in our procedure statement, so it's create procedure with the name of the procedure, list our parameters, then the word as, and then our query, which can just be as simple as a select statement. I've wrapped it in a begin and end block here. That's not necessary. You can create the stored procedure without that. I just do that because it's something I prefer to do. Once you get into the habit of that, you'll find that it will be beneficial when you're writing more extensive queries, because you can have multiple queries in one query window, and you want those begin and end blocks to separate those queries out to understand where you are within the query. And then to execute the stored procedure that we've created, we just write the word exec or execute. Again, they're interchangeable, it doesn't matter which way you prefer to do it. Indicate the stored procedure name, pass in your parameters, and you'll get the results. Like I say, within a software environment, so imagine you're working on, well, you go to any website, maybe a clothes website, and you click on an item. Now it may already be preloaded, but at some point what that's done has passed that item to the database and gone, tell me how many I've got in stock, tell me what sizes we've got in stock. And that's what the stored procedure allows us to do. So we can connect the code on the front end to execute that stored procedure, pass in the parameters, and then retrieve that information we need, and then present it nicely on screen. I will also be putting the samples of this code in the description, so don't feel like you have to actually copy the code. If you want to know some working examples, I will be leaving that in the description for you. So the benefits of stored procedures, guys, are that we've seen today we don't have to keep writing out the same query. So when I wanted to check the stock amount of a book, I didn't have to keep writing out that same query over and over again. The query I can store as a stored procedure. I can parameterize that query, so I can use that to search for different books in this case, or the other example when we went through where we only had 2 parameters, but I just wanted to show a multiple parameter example where we entered the customer's first name and last name, and then we could retrieve their address information. So that's another benefit of stored procedures, that we can pass parameters from them. Remember what I went over earlier, when in software we normally have the front end code, pass the parameter back to the stored procedure, execute that stored procedure, and then bring the results back and present them nicely on screen. Another benefit that we're not going to touch on too much here, because I am going to do a whole series of videos on working with stored procedures in a lot more detail and looking at execution plans, is we can also reuse the execution plans, which will give us better performance. And I have put there most of the time, so sometimes in rare scenarios that can be a hindrance to us. So what that means is when you process a query, the database engine has to work through that query. But if we can store how that query is normally executed, we will get much faster results, and that will be evident when you're running extensive stored procedures. So if you're having stored procedures that are taking 5 minutes, if you didn't have sort of stored execution plans and the ability to reuse those execution plans, you'd probably find that would actually take a bit longer. But like I say, don't worry about that too much now. We're going to be doing a whole series on stored procedures and performance as well. Thanks for watching the video, guys. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. If you'd like me to do a video on a certain topic, put that in the comments below as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I am uploading videos as regularly as I can. I usually get a couple a week done. And if you want to email me any information, any of your code to look over, you can at askbeardeddev@gmail.com. Thanks a lot for watching.